Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, or it could be whiskey with an analyst reading a spreadsheet, linking crime events, identifying a series, and getting the latest scoop on association news and training. So please don't beat that analyst and join us as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
Thank you for joining me. I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder, and today our guest has 14 years of law enforcement analysis experience. She is a certified fraud examiner with the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. She holds certifications with IALEIA and the White Collar Crime Center. She is also the current IALEIA Treasurer, here to tell us about how to follow the money. Please welcome Peggy Pingel. Peggy, how are we doing?
Doing very well. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. How is Colorado these days?
Colorado is a little dry, but the weather is perfect fall stuff, 75 to 80 degrees, and it's just beautiful.
Nice. It is. Colorado is unique to me because it just seems like you can get all types of weather. To me, even in the wintertime, you can just have these spells of like high temperatures just randomly in Colorado.
You bet. Yeah. And it's really nice because it snows in the mountains and we can still play golf in Denver. So it's just a really nice combination.
All right. Very good. Well, of course, I'm looking forward to talking about IALEIA and your position as treasurer, but I first want to get your background. So how did you discover the law enforcement analysis profession?
So I have an interesting entree into law enforcement because I was a mortgage banker for 30 years. And in 2010, when the real estate market was in crisis, it was a very hard time to be a loan officer because, according to the press, we were the evil, greedy people that had created the entire market breakdown. And at that time, I saw an article in the paper that said Colorado Bureau of Investigation had received a large federal grant and was going to be investigating mortgage fraud because that was the crime du jour, and they would be adding investigators to do this mortgage fraud investigation. So I started chasing that job and trying to figure out how to get an application in. And a year later, October of 21, I actually started work for CBI working on mortgage fraud investigations. So my position was basically to help the detectives, the agents, with the background knowledge of how mortgages and real estate work while they were working their way through those mortgage fraud investigations.
Now, when you're filling out the application, because obviously at this point in time you had never applied for a law enforcement position. So how was it filling out the application relative to what you had done previously?
So basically, what I concentrated on instead of educational background or industry background was skills that were transferable. So the fact that I knew mortgages and banking inside and out, the fact that my job as an originator was similar to an investigator in that I had to make sure that all the documents you presented in your mortgage application were valid and true to the best of my knowledge. And so I had to be critically looking at that documentation to see whether or not I thought that you were making them up or that was your actual documentation. So I just concentrated a lot on what I felt were transferable skills as opposed to the background in law enforcement.
And then what about the hiring process? When you went through your interviews, what was going through your mind? Do you remember?
So basically at each step, I assumed that I was not going to get the job. The first thing they did, they had a ton of applicants. So they had everybody come in and do a multiple choice test.
Okay.
And a couple days after I took the test, I got an email that said, "Hi, your score was like 67." And so I said to my husband, well, that's a D minus. So I guess I'm not going any further. And then the next couple days, I got an email that said, you're tied with 15 other applicants at 67. We're moving you to the next step.
There was a curve.
Basically, each time that I went through a step, I would come home and say, boy, I just don't know. So I submitted a writing sample, and although I didn't receive a score on that, I did advance to the next stage. And with each interview, it was like, man, I just don't know if I impressed them or not. And so all in all, I was very surprised when my boss finally called me and said, we'd like to offer you this position. And the next surprise to me was I had always been in private industry where you negotiated a salary, not government employee, where they said, this is what your salary will be.
Yeah.
But I was very excited about, and one of the things that I emphasized was that I liked puzzles, and I liked to solve puzzles and figure out how things went together, and that I didn't give up. That when I got to a barrier or a stopping point where I didn't know what was next, I kept after it. And I think that they needed the mortgage background. I know that they needed that expertise, but I think that was part of what also helped me, was just talking about keeping after things, because I believe that's something that is critical for an analyst, is you don't just quit when you run up against the first roadblock.
Yeah. Well, that seems like we're being pretty thorough. I mean, usually from what I've heard from most folks, and even when I was going through the application process, I mean, you might have one interview. It's rare that you would have two interviews. And I've been part of when you took one test, but it wasn't what you're describing here is like 4 or 5 stages. So it definitely seems like they were being particular.
Yeah, they were. And I was very pleased that my boss was willing to have an eclectic team, because usually a lot of people look for someone who's just like them to hire, because that's an easy supervisor position, right? So the agent that I was working with on these mortgage cases was a CPA, was a state auditor, who then went back and qualified as an agent. And me coming in from the mortgage industry and not from law enforcement. And then my boss was 30 years a cop and had great instincts. And so it was a very eclectic team, but we worked really well together.
Nice. All right. So then when you get in there, you get settled, you start working on cases. Do you have access to all the data that you're expecting, or I can kind of go through those growing pains a little bit that I'm guessing you had based on the data, right? So because you came from the private industry, which I'm sure has its own set of data, and then you go to the government and then you have a different set of data, and I'm sure you have certain expectations of the data that you want to see.
Right. And the nice thing for me was that one part of the data coming in, which was subpoena returns from title companies and mortgage companies, I was very comfortable with. And then the other piece of the data I had to get used to, figuring out FinCEN records and crim histories and cell phone records and things like that. But I mean, part of what I talk to new analysts about is data is data. And so if you know analysis techniques, then those same techniques can be applied whatever kind of data they throw at you, right? So I was pretty comfortable with bank statements and financial statements. And so when you learn to analyze those, then applying that same things back to cell phone data is still relatively straightforward. So I think that I had the advantage of a comfort level with some of those things and then learning the others. And then I was just learning as fast as I could everything about charges and elements of charges and what evidence you have to prove those charges, that kind of stuff, that my agent and my boss were very good about helping me with. I would go with my agent to a prosecutor's office and they would talk over my head for 30 minutes about what charges were appropriate. And then I would get back in the car and say to Kevin, okay, do all of that again in English. And he would sit down and talk about what does this mean that we have elements, and what does it mean you have to prove intent, and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I was just on a big learning curve about all of the law enforcement stuff. And then I'd go back and I'd hit those subpoena returns from a mortgage company, and I could settle down and just do something I was comfortable with. And the agent, I mean, when you get a 2,500 page subpoena return from a mortgage company, the average detective looks at that and goes, oh my God, right? And so the big piece of my job to start with was just to go back through that and index it and say, okay, here's the 200 pages you actually want to look at, and you can ignore all the rest of these other ones. And here's my report that says, yes, I believe there may be fraud involved, and here's why I think so, and here's what we would have to have in order to prove that there is or is not fraud from here. And so it gave him a big leg up on looking at all those documents, and I was very comfortable with that piece of it. So it created my value on the team, and therefore it was worth it to go through the other things they had to train me on, I guess.
So when you say 2,500, is that 2,500 with an electronic copy, or is that literal 2,500 pages?
It depends, right, on who you're talking to. For the mortgage companies, it was generally a gigantic PDF. But of course, when the bank statements came in, those were all their own little PDF, and you had to convert them into a spreadsheet. And so the first 2 years I worked there, we did not have bank scan. And I actually sat and went through all those bank statements and turned them into a spreadsheet. So you can imagine the time saved on the detective's part for me to go through and do that. So
yeah, I remember the days of getting a PDF version of cell phone records and having to go through that, trying to clean that up. In the early aughts, it wasn't like the PDF was more of like a screenshot. So some PDFs came through where the actual text wasn't selectable. So it was literally just a picture of the document. So then you're trying to scan it and use some kind of scan recognition software, which was just in its early phases, and then trying to go through and clean up the data.
I had a subpoena return from Chase Bank that was literally a paper box, like you would get paper for the copy machine, of paper bank statements, and it was a full paper box that they sent.
Oh my gosh.
So you had to scan them first and then OCR them and then go back and do your I'm with you.
Yeah. All right. Well, good. So give me an idea of the types of mortgage fraud that you're seeing at this time, because obviously you're dealing with a situation in which there's a mortgage crisis, and or at least maybe even coming out of a mortgage crisis. So in Colorado there, when you're first starting there, what would be a particular fraud, or just give us an example of what you were seeing?
So we had, for the most part, because we were working this task force, we were not doing cases where it was an individual fraud event, one person who lied on their mortgage application, and it was just that one off. Those we were referring back to the local agencies and said, we'll help you. We have a real estate person that can help guide you, but we're not doing those. What we were looking for was patterns where a group of people were doing the same thing over and over again and impacting multiple victims and multiple million-dollar losses and so forth. So we did most of our cases as RICO cases, and that's the kind of thing that we were looking for. So we had some where people were just plain lying to get on their applications just to get into the house, and then because they didn't really qualify, then they went into foreclosure because they weren't really capable of handling those payments. We had some where it was different people trying to help people avoid foreclosure. They had already qualified for their house, but now with the market going in the tank, then they were facing foreclosure. And so they were supposedly helping them avoid the foreclosure, and in the process making huge money off these people that had no equity in their house, but but the realtors or title company or whoever was assisting them was making money hand and fist on the backside that should have gone back either to the homeowner or to the bank, depending on what the circumstances were. So just a lot of different parts of the transaction that people can lie and create documents on. And so we were looking at those kind of ongoing fraud schemes where we felt like we could make a big difference because they were doing it over and over again.
Okay. So this gets into a little bit of the white collar crime aspect of it. So this isn't like what some might think where this is a group of people that are just specifically committing crimes without like a legitimate purpose, right? Like they could be that way, but this is obviously what you just described there as companies actually frauding out the citizen, for lack of a better term there, when the money should have went either back to the citizen or back to the bank, which you talked. So it's a legitimate company, but they're just kind of applying the rules incorrectly.
Right. So one of the cases that we worked on was a couple of real estate agents who would approach someone who was about to go into foreclosure. They would say to them, listen, we can help you. We will talk to the bank and take over all that communication. You won't have to talk to those evil people that call you daily and ask you to make payments. We're going to talk to them and we're going to help you get this as a short sale instead of a foreclosure because it's not so bad on your credit report, which is a true statement. But what they did is they put the title to the property into a trust, which people do all the time, but the homeowner should be the beneficiary of the trust. When they wrote trust documents without an attorney, just the realtors, they made themselves, the realtors, the beneficiaries of the trust. So they had basically taken over that property. At that point, they could have kicked the homeowners out because they weren't entitled anymore. So then the next step for them was twofold, was to go back to the existing mortgage company, and they had really ugly mold pictures and falling down building pictures that they took. They sent that off to the existing company and said, this property's a mess. There's more mortgage on it than the house is worth, and you should give us a really low short sale price so that we can just get this property sold. And you guys don't want to end up with it through the foreclosure because you'll have to do all this work. And so they were showing them these pictures and all this stuff on one side. On the other side, they instantaneously listed it in the multiple listing service, showing it as the Taj Mahal, right? This is a great property. It's not got any problems. Here's how much we can sell it for. And then they closed on the short sale one day, and the next day they sold it for that higher price, and they kept all of that price differential.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when they're showing the mold pictures and the disarray pictures, was those, I'm assuming those at times were just either photoshopped or just totally erroneous pictures.
Right, because you can't really tell. If you have a moldy basement, you can't really tell whether it belongs to that property or not. And so you could use them over and over again. Yeah, if you have just a picture of a bad roof without any perspective in the picture to know that it's for that property, that kind of stuff. They had an inspector that helped them out. I think an appraiser that helped them out. I can't remember all the people that were in the group, but we had 7 defendants, I think, in that particular case that we did.
Yeah. And so in that case, not only is this, I called them citizens before, but the homeowners in that, the original homeowners, their credit gets shot and has a hard time buying a future home. And then the bank, they're out hundreds of thousands potentially because now they took this property, did a short sale, came down on the price, they lost money there. And then the real estate agents, as you described, are making out because they got in that situation, bought it low and sold it high.
Right. And so they have commission off of both sales, and they have the difference in price off the change of sale. Yeah. And their defense was that they were just helping the homeowners, that a foreclosure would be worse on their credit than the short sale, and that it was just a good business plan. It wasn't really anything that was illegal. And so one of the things we had to prove was intent, right? And so once we got a hold of their computers and we had all of their emails, then we had all these emails going back and forth between the parties saying, don't tell the seller this, don't tell the primary mortgage this, don't tell the new lender that. And so then we were able to establish intent. They knew that what they were doing was wrong, because they were hiding all these things from the various parties.
And that also feeds into conspiracy and RICO.
You bet. Yeah. Of being able to say, yes, here's what this person's job was. And that's your main thing in the RICO cases, is describing the enterprise and then describing each person's job within that enterprise for the enrichment of all of the folks in the enterprise. And so, yeah.
So from your vantage point as a new analyst, it seems pretty straightforward, but was it straightforward in terms of proving this with the data?
No, it was a learning curve, just like any new analyst has. I don't think it matters what kind of data you have. And I feel sorry for new analysts now, because they have even more data sources coming at them that they have to be able to coordinate and whatever. But I did have a very good prosecutor and agent that we did most of our stuff with, who explained to me very early that you must keep track for each of these charges and elements. You must keep track of where that proof exists inside of all of your data. So I had a giant Word document, which I called the Bible, and the prosecutor called my source document, where I literally wrote down, for this charge and this element, the proof exists in Exhibit 42 on page 2500 of 2750. So that when somebody asked me, how do you know, then I could go back and find them, right? And it's a little different, I think, when you start with kind of knowing what you have to prove versus if you have like a drug trafficking case and you're just starting from subject and you're just trying to correlate all the data you get regarding those people, places, and things, and then figure out a pattern. When I got through the mortgage files, I had a pretty good idea of the pattern. So then I was going back to, what else do I need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt these other things, right? And so I think that's what helped me when I started, was just approaching it from that side of, I have a pretty good idea of what I have to prove. I think the cases, like when I quit doing mortgage fraud and started just doing cybercrime, then you're starting from ground zero, right? I have an account number and I have an IP address, and now I got to figure out everything about this person. And you start accumulating data, and you've got to find the patterns yourself. And I think those are harder. And I didn't do those in my first 3 years.
So just out of curiosity, the one case you were just talking about with the 7 different defendants, how did that end up?
So because this is white collar crime, because for the most part, you have defendants with essentially no criminal history, we knew we weren't going to get jail time, right? So basically our goal when we did plea agreements with these folks was to get convictions on felony counts that involved a position of trust with someone else's money. Because when you have those felony counts, then they are unlikely to be able to go back to any industry where they have to be licensed, right? They can't be a realtor, they can't be a loan officer, they can't be an insurance agent or a financial planner. It gets them away from other people's money when you have those felony charges. So that was kind of our goal, was that we would get convictions or a plea agreement for those felony charges. So all 7 of those defendants pled to enough felony charges that we felt that we would not end up with them being licensed for something else, and no jail time.
Okay. And then how about restitution?
The restitution would hang over them for however long. I mean, we basically, because you went back and calculated how much losses those banks suffered on those short sales, and then piled that on to each of those defendants. So, yep. Whether it ever got paid was another question.
Oh, yeah, that's the bummer part. How many victims were there?
So that's the other interesting thing about doing these cases, because we had 75 properties that we identified that this group did this same scheme on. And so, like, you don't want any jury to listen to 75 things, right? Their eyes are just going to glaze over and they're not going to be with you. And so I said to my agent, well, we need to do the 80-20 rule. And he looked at me funny and he said, what's that? And I said, well, when you're a salesperson, 80% of your sales comes from 20% of your people. So I said, if we go through and pick the top 20% of these properties, then we're likely to still end up with 80% of the charges, but not have to show the jury that many properties. So that's what we did. We had 15 properties. So I had 15 bank losses that we showed altogether to add up to whatever our restitution was.
Yeah. And I'm sure the bank was probably pretty cooperative in this situation. I'm guessing that they really wanted to try to get some of their money back and to obviously thwart future situations of this type of fraud.
Yeah, they're just not a very sympathetic victim when you actually go in front of a jury.
Yeah.
When you say, oh, this big bank lost this much money, it's like, well, yeah, but.
Yeah.
So the agent that I worked with, his theory on all of this was that we put our cases together to the nth degree and took them to the prosecutor. And then when discovery went out, we sent everything. So that those defense attorneys, when they got that discovery, they turned around to their client and said, listen, dude, you're stuck. You better take the plea. And it really worked. We had only one case out of all of that actually went in front of a jury. So we had lots of motion hearings and that kind of stuff, but only one that went clear through trial. So.
All right.
Hi, this is Sheila Dorn. Do you want to build your credibility with field personnel, with police officers on the street? Get a candy dish, put it on your desk, and fill it with good candy. That's your opportunity to talk with people and engage. You can send out 1 million emails. People might know your name, but they don't really know you until you talk to them face to face. And that candy dish is an opportunity to talk with people and really get to know them.
My name is Havelka, and a pet peeve is people who hoard information when we're all supposed to be working together. If there's one thing I can't stand, it's being on a case where someone is holding on to all the pieces of information like a squirrel holding their collection. At the end of the day, we all have the same goal: to solve the problem, investigate, and help get the job done. When we share what we know, everyone wins.
I'm Erica Logan, and my public service announcement is if you are in the left lane and not passing anyone, move over because you're holding up progress for the rest of us.
Well, this actually brings us to your analyst badge story. And for those that may be new to the show, the analyst badge story is the career-defining case or project that an analyst works. And for you, it's 2015, and the case that went to trial is happening. And so you were in another unique situation as second chair to the Attorney General.
Yeah, this was an interesting deal. It was a family-run mortgage company. And so the indictments were for the main owner and his wife, his father and mother, and his twin brothers that were younger than him were our 6 defendants. And it started with a default on a giant SBA loan. They had gotten a $2 million SBA loan in order to create a fancy office down in downtown Denver. And they defaulted on that SBA loan. And as the trustee was taking over the property, they finished the foreclosure and then they were going into the property to change locks and see what was going on. What they found was mortgage files just scattered everywhere on the floor, and all of that data that's included in a mortgage file. And so they called CBI and said, can you help us to secure all of this documentation? Because clearly we can't just throw it in the trash because there's too much PII in all these documents to just throw them in the trash. So our agents went down and helped to box up all this stuff, and it was stored at a secure storage area. And then the agent I was working with got a search warrant to say, we'd like to just go back through all of those documents and see if there's anything else we can find. And so that's where we started. And we ended up establishing a pattern where if you came in to do a purchase or a refinance with them, once they got that loan closed, then they would say to you, you're eligible for our investor program and you can buy 2 more houses as an investor and we will help you put tenants in. And so somebody else will make your mortgage payments and you'll get the equity as it grows and life will be so good. And so that's the scheme that they were running. And they did, in fact, put tenants in the houses for as long as they could put tenants in. But when the market went crazy, then it was hard to find tenants. And they just let all those things go into foreclosure because it wasn't the mortgage people's names that were on these loans. It wasn't their credit that was going to be messed up. They just deserted these homeowners that they had put into investor homes. So that's sort of where the scheme was. And so we had done all of our mortgage files and title files and everything else. But by the time we got ready to go to trial, and 5 of the 6 defendants took a plea deal. Only the guy that was the main owner of the company decided that he was smarter than all the rest of us and he was going to take this to trial. So by the time we got ready for trial, my agent that I'd been working with had retired from the state and took a position in private industry where he could make more money. So they could subpoena him for the testimony that he had to give, but not for the whole 3 weeks of the trial. And just to show you, even at that point, how much I didn't know about law enforcement and trials, I was downtown at the AG's office and we were going back through exhibits to make sure that we had everything we needed for trial. And the 2 senior AGs were standing there as I walked into the office. And one of them pointed at me and said to the one that was really going to do the trial, Janet said to Rob, maybe she should sit next to you. And I didn't actually realize what that meant. I thought she meant that day at the table. I sat down on his side of the table. And then I realized what they were actually talking about was that I would actually sit as the advisory witness and be able to do the whole trial. And so it was an amazing experience for me because prior to that, I had come in, I had done my little bit of testimony, I had gone away. The agent was there all the time, but I wasn't, right? And so I got to watch jury selection and I got to see all of the different pieces that go into this. And I testified a lot for that particular trial. And so when we got done, the jury convicted on 14 of 19 of our felony charges. And the other piece of this story is that when we did indicted and arrested the family, the wife had immediately filed for divorce. And he was afraid she was going to talk to us because these indictments were brand new and then she was filing for divorce. So he assaulted her. So he bonded out on that. While he was in jail, she moved in with a friend of hers. When he got out of jail, he figured out where she was staying. He broke into the friend's house and assaulted her again. When he bonded out on that, Then they put a tracking monitor, an ankle monitor on him, and he couldn't figure out where she had gone. But he bought a burner phone and a stalker app, and he tied them to her mother's car and then followed her to where she was staying and assaulted her for a third time. So those assault charges came up for trial earlier than my mortgage case did. And it was lots of fun to help that prosecutor draw maps with the cell phone data and his monitoring data going beep, beep, beep together all the way from Denver to Colorado Springs, right? Anyway, he received a 24-year sentence on the assault charge.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Like, so that must have been a pretty severe series of assaults then to get 24 years, right?
And 3 different times, and escalating each time. So anyway, the prosecutor on that did a great job, and he ended up with this 24 years. So at the time, the AG went to him and said, we're going to offer you a 2-for-1 deal. So you plead guilty to all of our felony charges, and we will agree for a concurrent 24. So no additional jail time to what you're facing now, but the extra felony charges on your record, so we know that you can't be a lender or a realtor anymore. And he said no. He was going to beat us, and he did not. He was sure that he would come out on top. So anyway, when we got to the end of the mortgage trial, he was eligible for anywhere from 16 to 48 years based on our 14 felony charges. And the judge sentenced him to 24, but consecutive, not concurrent.
Wow.
And so that was like the highlight, because on a white collar crime, you just don't get that kind of sentencing, right? And so it was our pretty amazing case that we did. And like I say, it was a very good learning experience for me to see the whole trial experience and to actually deal with defense attorneys and understanding why my boss and my agent were so picky about how I put evidence together and how I handled it and how all of those steps went during the time that you're preparing a case, because of getting back into a courtroom and hearing what the defense attorneys were saying and presenting, and actually understanding why all these minutiae were so important while you were developing a case. And so from that standpoint, it was just a really good learning experience for me to be able to sit an entire trial.
Yeah. Because even with the felonies that he received for the assaults, in theory, after he got out at 24 years or with good behavior, he would still be able to get on their hands on other people's money, like you described, right? So that wouldn't have necessarily prohibited him from having some kind of mortgage certification, financial certification.
So it would depend on whatever board was looking at the licensing request. So if he said, yes, I have felonies, but it was just related to an ugly divorce, it was a misunderstanding, whatever, then potentially they could have looked at that, as you say, and said it doesn't really apply to his work history, and therefore we're going to grant him such and such a license. But almost every board, if you have a felony that's related to the fact that you took advantage of a position of trust and took away other people's money, they're just not going to give you a license.
Yeah. And the other 5 family members, you mentioned they pled out. It was a similar resolution as you described, where they got felonies but no jail time.
Yeah. And the interesting thing was his dad was not in the country legally. And so I know it's a big deal now about whether or not you talk to ICE, but at that point, he was deported because he had a felony conviction in Colorado and was not here legally. And so he was actually deported. As far as I know, he was back in the country with his family not too long after that, but there was a deportation at the time because he had a felony conviction. And so, and he knew at the time that was part of the deal when he pled to the felonies, but everyone else took their plea and went away. And even the wife, who had to testify for the assault charges, our AG went to her and said, if you will come in and testify to the assault charges and be honest and faithful with your testimony on the assaults, we will not call you for the mortgage trial and make you face him again after that. Because we feel the charges that really need to be on his criminal record are those assault charges. I mean, let's face it, white collar crime is not going to deter anything anywhere except the licensing. And so those assault charges is what really needs to be on his record. And so she did, and we never called her for the mortgage trial.
So I guess that you talked about puzzles earlier and about things coming together, and I have a tendency to be an equations guy, like trying to see how everything flows more linearly. It just how everything balances out in an equation. And right now I'm going back to the beginning of the story, which has the people taking over the building, in which all this evidence is just sitting in a room on the floor. So I have a hard time understanding why these 6 people just left all this evidence in this building.
Right? I mean, that was our question too. And we debated about the bank that had taken over said, we'll just let you look through all that. And my agent said, no, if we find something that we want to take to trial, we want to make sure that there's no question that we had the authority to look through that paperwork. And so he went and got a search warrant and served it on that bank that now owned this stuff because it was in their building, and served it on them before we ever looked at any of those files. And like I say, I didn't understand necessarily up front why he was being so picky, but when I got into trial, then I could see how defense could have, if they had been able to say all of those mortgage files that we looked at originally that created our probable cause for everything else we did, if they'd been able to throw those out, we'd had nothing left, right?
Fruit of the poisonous tree, right?
Yeah, because just watching defense attorneys tear things apart. When I got to the end of this particular trial, the AG said to me, all right, we're doing closing statements tomorrow, and here's what I want you to know. This attorney has no defense. The only thing that he can do is tear you down so that the jury doesn't believe the things that you testified to. And so you better have the world's best poker face tomorrow, because that everything he does is going to say you did it wrong, and you better be ready. And just things like that had never occurred to me until I actually sat a trial.
Yeah. So do you think you have a good poker face?
Not generally, no. And so, he said, I don't want you rolling your eyes. I don't want you just have to sit here and listen like he's reading you the phone book, because that's all the reaction I want out of you while he does this. It's very interesting.
A lot goes into that, right? You were talking about all the work and the documentation, and then you have game day, the day when you go testify. So that's a big deal. Was it just one day of testifying, or I think you said you testified several times, right?
Yeah, several days during the trial, just depending on the pieces of the evidence that we wanted to present and the order that he wanted them presented in. And so, I actually had several days that I did that. And I think that my sales training helped me there because I could just talk to the jury and talk to them like a mortgage banker. The very first time I testified at grand jury was just basically a mortgage 101, right? You've got grand jurors that you don't know if they've ever
bought a house, sold a house, lost a house. I mean, you have no idea what their relation to real estate is. And so I was just doing a basic thing that says, here's how mortgages work, here's how real estate works. Well, to me, that was a first-time homebuyer class. That's what you do with first-time homebuyers, is explain all that stuff to them. But we walked out of the grand jury room that day, and my agent and the HUD agent that we were working with on that particular case looked at me and said, oh my gosh, that stuff just falls out of your mouth. Well, it took me a minute to realize why they were surprised, right? Because they had never seen me being a salesperson.
Yeah.
So to me, it was falling back into what I knew. That was 30 years worth of stuff. I could do that.
Yeah.
Where most of the time I was the newbie. I was asking questions. I was tentative. I was trying to make sure I did everything perfect, right?
Yeah.
When I got there, it was like, relax, do a first-time homebuyer class. Life is good. So it's interesting where those things come. And one of the things that AG said to me as he was prepping me for testimony was, you will never answer a question immediately after it's put to you. Whenever the defense asks you a question, you will take a deep breath, you will let it out slowly, and you will give me time to object.
Yep.
Before
I
you
remember that. I remember that speech too.
Yep. And so it was interesting because a couple times it was the defense attorneys that couldn't stand the silence, right? Of taking that breath and letting it out, and they would jump into that space. Whereas for me as a salesperson, silence is part of the sales techniques.
Yeah.
I have no problem with just being quiet. And I know it doesn't seem like it today because I talk a lot, but when it's appropriate.
I do appreciate that.
When it's appropriate, I can be quiet. So anyway, it's just different places where my different background actually fed into the things that I needed to be able to do as an analyst.
Yeah, that's a great story, and that's very interesting. I do want to move on though to, as you mentioned before, you get into cybercrime. And so I want to talk a little bit about that transition, because as you mentioned, that was a different ball game in itself.
It was. And the interesting thing is that the first cyber crimes that we were dealing with primarily had to do with real estate, because there's a lot of money diversion that is attempted against real estate transactions. Real estate is prime for that because they move a lot of money, and there's a lot of urgency already built into real estate transactions. You got to do this today because we got to close tomorrow kind of stuff. And so when we started in on those, then one of the things I was so pleased with my agents about was a change of mindset for them. So as we started working on these cases, what we realized was that, a standard cop attitude is, once you get a case, it's reactionary, right? Then you go to try figure out who did it and all this other stuff. And that's the direction that the cops usually move. I sat down and talked to them and said, we need to deal with the money first, because if that money goes overseas, we have essentially no chance of getting it. So I don't care who did it. Let's see what we can do about stopping that money from going overseas the instant that we're notified about this crime. And they were willing to take that mindset shift and work that way. And so when a call came into us that said, we've got a transaction that's gone astray, it was like all hands on deck, trying to get a hold of the bank, trying to find out where the money was sitting, getting it locked down. And so you can't just ask the bank to return it. The receiving bank has to do their own investigation before they decide whose money it really is. But we ask the receiving bank to just lock it. Don't give it to anybody until you have enough information to make a valid decision about whose money this is.
Okay.
And we were very successful at that.
Okay.
And
so by the time you were really looking into it, the money had already been transferred. It just didn't make it to the recipient. It was still at the station, so to speak, at that bank that was receiving the funds.
Right. Because most of the time on these scams, it's actually
two different scams happening at the same time, right? So you have somebody that has been grooming a romance scam victim for a long time, and then all of a sudden says to them, listen, I've got an insurance proceeds from my grandmother dying, and I'm overseas and it needs to go into a US bank. Are you okay if this money comes into your account and goes back out? Sounds reasonable to the person who thinks they're in the middle of this romance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then that's the account that my real estate, the home buyer's deposit money, that's the account that lands in. So you really have two different scams operating in order for them to get this money moved into an account they believe they have control over and then back out to them overseas. And so we're trying to catch it at that receiving bank. Just hang on to it until we can show you what we think really happened. And so we started there with just trying to get ahead of it, trying to do prevention instead of reactive policing as much as we could. And then because I was a salesperson, then I went out and I did a lot of training. So we trained title closers, real estate agents, small businesses at the Chamber of Commerce, senior centers, just talking about how do these work? How do you prevent from getting in the middle of them? Just a lot of training that we went out to do because we felt prevention was actually our very best tool. Most of the time, the bad guys aren't in this country. Most of the time, once the money moves out of the country, we couldn't get it back.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we figured out who did it, we weren't likely to be able to put charges against them. And so off we went, trying to stop the money first and then figure out, is this someone we've seen before? Is this someone we've got FinCENs on and we can create a group that we think is doing this together and we could actually get it to somebody that could investigate it? We did that stuff after to see what else we could actually make charges on.
In terms of Colorado, in terms of your 30 years of experience in the mortgage industry, how much were you seeing where the proceeds would go overseas? Is that typical?
Almost always.
Oh, okay.
Yep. And so yes, it was very difficult to actually get a hold of a person. And even now with all the big data that like FBI analysts have and so forth of trying to track company incursions or malware, cybercrime, they're still in that same kind of boat to a certain extent of even if you figure out who it is, can we actually get them up on charges, get them in the US to face a court and whatever?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. All right. I do want to get to IALEIA, so I don't want to bury that lead too much. But before we do, I was curious, you had in your introduction, you have several certifications that you have. And in your own opinion, with your own experience, which certification you found to be the toughest to obtain?
To be honest with you, the Certified Fraud Examiner, it is set up like a CPA exam. So you have 4 different tests that you have to take. You have to have your passing grade on each of them, not an average. And I was lucky enough that my boss sent me to a week-long thing. So you studied one section of that. I mean, you did your studying before you went, then you did a review all day long of one section, and then you took your exam at the end of that day. And then you tried to take all that stuff out of your brain, and then you did the second section the next day. And you did 4 long, hard days, and you passed all 4 exams in 1 week. Yeah, which I preferred, but you can do they have a great self-study and whatever, but it's set up that way with 4 different sections that you have to be an expert in, and you must have a passing grade in each, and very similar to what the CPA exam is. So that one I think was the toughest in terms of just qualifying and getting there. The certified analyst from IALEIA, when I started looking into that one and they handed me that 21st century book and said, just know everything in this 2-inch book and you'll be fine to take your exam, was a little daunting. But when you read through the whole book and you went back and said, okay, which pieces of this do I not do in my daily analysis tasks that I need to study more, because the stuff that's associated with what I do every day, I feel comfortable answering questions about. So which pieces of this is not a part of my standard job duties, and therefore I need to go back and look at it more closely. So for me, that was crime statistics, because I never did anything with crime statistics. And so that was the piece that I had to go back and really study and really pay attention to before I took that exam.
Gotcha. All right. Well, let's get into IALEIA then, because as I mentioned, you are the current treasurer, and so that's the executive board position. So just want to get your general impressions on how you got there and just your general thoughts on IALEIA.
Oh dear. So 2 years ago, when I first was appointed, it was because the treasurer at that time did not stand for re-election, and no one else ran either. And so they had elections in April. They got to the board meeting in July, where the new board starts, and they did not have a treasurer. So anyway, so I was appointed to that position for my first term. I think primarily because of the fact that I had taught with a bunch of the board members in different fiat classes. They knew that banking was sort of my passion and the thing I got on a soapbox about, that they asked me to take on that position originally. Then this last election cycle, I was the only one that ran. So there I am again.
So then with your 30 years of mortgage and now all your experience, taking that portion over as treasurer, was it easy, or did it surprise you maybe how it was more difficult than you thought?
Well, there's a fair amount of nonprofit tax information that I didn't know. I have read corporate tax returns forever, but not necessarily nonprofit tax returns. So I did have a learning curve with the accountants over the differences between what a regular corporation operates as and how a nonprofit operates. So that was a fairly big learning curve with the accountants. And then the thing that actually surprised me is how many just individual vendor requests we need to fill out in order to accommodate our members. So if your agency is going to pay your dues for you, then whatever paperwork they require to get us set up as a vendor in their system so that they can pay your dues, I get to play with those. And so, so you never know when they're going to show up. They almost always need to be done fairly quickly because we just would like you to be able to pay your dues. And of course, we need to do them so that, in fact, your agency will pay your dues and the individual members don't have to do that. And so it's an important thing that we do for our members, but it's kind of in the background. I don't think anybody really thinks about it till you get in this position and they start showing up in your email.
Yeah. Well, of course, so there's the treasury portion of your position, but you're also on the executive board. So then there's a whole just general business of the association too that you're a part of.
Yeah. And I think it's probably true for anybody that gets on a board. It takes a while to get your feet under you, right? To know how a board works and to figure out what part of the corporate knowledge of that particular association you just don't know. And so I kind of felt like my first term, there was a lot of that, of just figuring out how things are supposed to work. I'm really excited about this term that just started in July. We have some new board members. They've got a lot of energy and commitment to the association. We're working on a very good strategic plan and really locking down what we want to accomplish over this next 2-year term. I'm really excited about how people are working together and the vision that they have for their individual portfolios moving forward. The gal that was elected for our new international director is amazing, and the same way with the new person coming into communications. And so I think it's going to be great when they, like I say, get their feet under them a little and are able to actually put some of their vision into impact. I'm pretty excited about where this board is headed.
Yeah. One of the things that Alex Goulday, I had him on the show lots last year. You given me IALEIA updates. And of course, he is the chair of the elections committee for IALEIA. And I want to get your take on the election process. You, as you mentioned, you got appointed the first time, but now this time, second time around, you did go through election, even though you ran unopposed. But there were several other positions that were up for election as well that had, I think, up to 4 people running. One of the things I'm curious to know, and this is a long-standing rule with IALEIA, is the limitation on candidates. For those that might not be aware, really there's not much campaigning, there's not much talk outside the association. It is 200, I think, word proposal that you write up for your candidacy, and really that's it, right? That's really all the more that you can talk about your candidacy. So I'm curious to get your take on that limitation and whether you're in favor with it or would like to see changes.
So I know that it's very different than some other associations, but I kind of like the lack of arm twisting. I like the fact that in order to be known by folks and get their approval, their trust, it means that before you're running, you're involved in the association in some way, shape, or form, right? You're a chapter president, you serve on an active committee, you do something so that more people know you. Because just putting, as you say, just putting your 200 words in and you haven't done anything else, I don't think you'll pull a lot of trust out of people if that's all they know about you. So I like that piece of it, that it encourages people to be active at other levels before, it's not required before they run for the board, but I think they have a better chance of having people know who they are. And so that piece of it I actually like.
So I think one of the downsides to it, though, is the low turnout rate for voting. 4,000 members to IALEIA, and it's usually just a couple hundred people voting. If people are out talking to people, that'll get them to vote, and the turnout might be a little bit better.
I can see that point of view. And I think that in general, more communication within the association in general is a really solid goal. And I believe that Olivia's got some good ideas to create those avenues of more communication. If you can get some communication flowing where we can talk about what's really the best way to do this, I would hate for the board to do it and make changes in isolation. Does that make sense to you? Of that, I would want some really good discussion around whatever the options might be before we looked at making changes just for change's sake.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm not sure the exact structure. I mean, I don't think that's a bylaws change or anything, but I would always encourage to have discussion and have membership input on any association change of that magnitude.
Right. Yeah. And even just on general direction things, it would be nice to feel like we had more people involved, because I think you're right. There's a lot of folks that they join, they take advantage of trainings, some come to conference, but there's a lot that we're not reaching. And so is it because they really just don't need it? Or is it because we're not making the proper efforts? And so I think always communication is the answer, and that will always have to be a top priority of an association.
All right. Well, very good. Let's go on to our advice section then. What advice do you have for our listeners, whether that's a new analyst, experienced analyst, and maybe something that they can study now that'll be important 5 years from now? Anything like that. What kind of advice do you have?
So I think my advice is learn always. Our world is changing so fast, and you can't just take a couple of skills and say, I'm good at these things, that makes me a good analyst, and you're done. And maybe that's only because I came into law enforcement. I was the oldest person on the floor. I had a lot of stuff to learn, but I found it exciting and it was challenging, and I loved learning all that new stuff. And I think every analyst is going to be in that position, at least for the foreseeable future, right? Who knew 10 years ago that you'd be dealing with big data, that you would have 14 different data sources that would come into your case, and you had to be able to put them in a format where you could sort and filter, and you had to be able to make associations and patterns out of that many different data sources. The whole title of data scientist didn't even exist back 3 or 4 years ago, right? And so I just think the biggest thing is learn always. And sort of in connection with that, what I always talk to new analysts about when we're doing a fiat class is find some aspect of that data of your job description that you're really passionate about. So obviously financials was what I was passionate about because that's the background I came from. But it could be anything. It could be big data. It could be network analysis. It could be cryptocurrency. It can be, I don't care. Find something that you think is really exciting to learn, and then make yourself an expert in whatever that is, because that brings true value both to you for your continuing job, your career journey, but also to your agency to have someone that they can depend on for whatever that is. And so I think that's a part of that learn all the time, is that's not necessarily something your agency is going to say, listen, I've got this great training I want you to go to. You're going to have to figure out what's exciting and then go do that training however you can get it done. Bring it back to your supervisor and say, I want to do this. I found 3 that are online and I don't have any expense or not much expense for, and then this 4th one you need to pay so I can go do training, or whatever it is. That it's incumbent upon the analyst to get after that stuff and get the training that they need to become that expert, and explain to your agency, yes, it's good for me, but it's also good for you because I can do these things for our agency and it makes our agency better. So I think that's really what I would say to anybody that's in the middle of all this stuff.
That's great advice. All right, well, let's finish up with personal interest, and I'm smiling ear to ear because your personal interest is square dancing, and I always enjoy this question because I never quite know what answer I am going to get. So let's finish this interview talking about square dancing.
So my husband and I met on the campus of the University of Colorado in Boulder at a square dance class, and we have been dancing for 50 years, and it is still our main source of exercise. It's really good to do your body and your brain at the same time and make both of them work. It's the outside of our families, it's our main source of long-term friendships and people who really know you and are really there for you. And it's just plain fun. Square dancers are just, I have found them to be the very nicest people. And so we love it, and we hope to continue doing it for another 20 years. So anyway.
How often do you get to dance?
Well, right now we're caretaking for my dad, so not as much. But in general, when we're at home and doing our own schedule, 2 or 3 nights a week, and that's about 2 hours each time. So.
All right. Yeah, that is a commitment to do it that often. And
it's fun. Yeah. And yeah.
Yeah. Now, is there any kind of resurgence for like the next generation? Is there young people getting into square dancing?
Boy, I think it's a really hard thing because you had said to me that you had square dancing in junior high.
Yes.
School. And of course, it's crazy to start kids off at that age because at that point they're at that ooh girls stage.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's hard to get them to do that. But Mitch and I facilitated for a while a performance team that had middle school, high school, college kids. And we had so much fun dancing with kids because they're like, nothing is fatal. If things fall apart, they just laugh and start over. And I mean, middle school to college is a pretty wide age range. I sometimes had my middle school kids dancing up to the level of my college kids, and I sometimes had my college kids playing down to the level of my middle school kids. But it was just so much fun to dance with them. Right now, kids are so into their screens. I don't know how to get them out of that and away from electronics. Most of the kids that started with our performance team, it's because their parents danced and they grew up thinking this was okay. And so therefore they would come and dance with us. But to walk into a middle school now and say, hey, guess what? Square dancing like your grandma does. I just don't know. Even as a salesperson, I'm not sure that's the right way to do it.
Yeah, I was going to say, you really need to show your sales skills there.
Right? On the other hand, if you can get them to do it, they all have a good time. And so I'm not sure how to make that break in, get them started sort of thing. While we had our performance teams, I used to say to my middle school boys, if you will learn to dance, then when you get to high school, it will not matter if you're short or tall, if you're a band geek or an athlete. If you will walk across that gym floor, put your hand out and ask a girl to dance, you are in like Flynn. And several of them took me seriously. I had one who his first high school dance, of course, was homecoming. And he came home and said to his mom, I danced all night long with seniors. If I get invited to prom, are you going to let me go? And it was just, but that's part of what it was, is just walk across that room and ask someone to dance. And anyway, I always felt it was very good for them, but they all graduated. That's the problem of dealing with children. They grow up and move away on you. So
no, and it reminds me, I was just trying to Google it real quick. It reminds me of the Harry Potter story. There was the one guy that danced all night and he came home in awe. I'm dropping the character's name right now, but yeah, I could see that.
Wasn't it Neville?
Yes, there you go. Yes, yeah, it was Neville that came.
He was shy and retiring, and everybody, but if he asked people to dance, they danced with him, right?
Yeah, and he was out all night, right, and it just as you're describing. So.
Yep, it's fun. So anyway, we have a good time with it, and hope that we'll just keep dancing. So.
All right. Excellent. All right. Well, our last segment of the show is Words to the World, and this is where you can promote any idea that you wish. Peggy, what are your words to the world?
So I think my words are coming out of my salesman background, and that is network, network, network. My boss at CBI came from a good Italian family, and he would always walk into my cubicle and go, "Have you got a guy?" And so I think this is part of the value that analysts bring, is you don't have to know everything, but you got to know where to go to get it. And so the bigger your network is, the better off you're going to be at that. And so find people who are good at the parts that you aren't as good at, so that you have somebody to help you when you get that far, right? If I had to do crime stats, I'd be lost, but I know several people who are really good at it. And if it became part of one of my presentations, they would help me to put it together and make it look professional. It's having analysts clear across the country, so that when you need something out of California, you have got a guy that you can call. Even if it's a nice lady in Sacramento, you can call and get what you need. And so I know a lot of analysts think of themselves as introverts, but if you think about the fact that the rest of them are all doing the same thing and saying, I don't know if I want to talk to people, you can be brave enough to just start the conversation and collect those business cards or trade them in your phone, or however you collect those addresses and that contact information. And I always put a little note in my contact information about where I met them and anything else they told me, so that I can call and say, listen, I met you at the IACA conference. How did your son's soccer tournament go? And then I ask my favor. And it's amazing how much you can get people to help you, and then you look like you're amazing because you always know where to go to find that info. And so I think it's one of the things that analysts can do to make them valuable beyond measure in their agencies is if they know the right people to talk to, or they know the first one who'll refer them on to the second one that actually gets them their info. Whatever it is, however that gets you what you need, where you show up magically with the right answer that other people have been just stumped by how would I ever know what to do about that. And so that's my words, network.
Very good. Well, leave every guest with you. You've given me just enough to talk bad about you later.
Oh.
But I do appreciate you being on the show. Thank you so much, and you be safe.
You bet. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for making it to the end of another episode of Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. You can show your support by sharing this and other episodes found on our website at www.leapodcasts.com. If you have a topic you would like us to cover or have a suggestion for our next guest, please send us an email at leapodcasts@gmail.com. Till next time, analysts, keep talking.